So the opposite of mission is, the version 2.0 of Space for the Rest of Us, which is to kill the mission mindset. And exactly what would that mean, right? First, what is the mission mindset? The mission mindset is justify it as sort of, it's human destiny, it's for the benefit of mankind, all these things we're going to learn. Okay, that's all great, and I wouldn't say that's worthless, but why do it in space? You can learn new things any place. You can explore the bottom of the sea, you can do cancer research. We have a million different ways we can do research now. Why should we be going into space to do research, which is so expensive and so risky that we really do very little research per dollar, because it just costs a lot to get there. And because the risk is so great that we spend a lot on reliability, and we should. Not that the engineering is wrong, but as a place to get inspiration and to find out new things, it's fairly diluted by all the practicalities of working there. And I mean, everything is for the benefit of mankind. Symphony orchestra is for the benefit of mankind. Why space, right? Why do we want to do that? And why spend these billions of dollars so that the techies and the bureaucrats can work in their offices for 10 years, and one day you turn on the television set and pictures of Pluto or whatever it is. And it's like, I'm not, a cosmologist. I'm not an astrophysicist. Yeah, it's impressive. It's interesting. I'll look at it on the web for 10 minutes, and then I'm going to go back to what affects my life, what affects me every day. So when that happens, you can say, well, we accomplished it. Mission successful. We put the rover on Mars and it blah, blah, blah. For 6 months, for 1 year, it wandered, it got all these samples, it did everything. Great. That's the best outcome. And then what? Then you go back to step one. Okay, for the benefit of mankind, for our destiny as humans among the stars, we're going to now do the next magical trick. 10 years later, a couple of $1 billion later, you do it all again. That's the cycle we're in. And eventually, people decide that they're tired of that they'd rather spend their money on things that's going to make them, let's say, live longer or live better or something like that, and not just be entertained. There's plenty of entertainment out there. What's the opposite of the mission mindset? The opposite of the mission mindset is to do something that changes your life, right? And those things are pretty outlandish. And so then I run the risk, and maybe I enjoy that risk, of being considered totally out of touch with reality. I've been there before in my life, so I'll do it again, right? Here's the life-changing innovation that I would show as like a paradigm. The trouble with this paradigm is people say, well, that's impossible. Therefore, it has no relevance. We'll just go back to doing missions. But let's just play with the idea of creating a city on the moon, okay? A city on the moon is not a mission, it's a city. A city is not a mission. A city is a permanent part of human infrastructure that essentially will go on for tens of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years, where people are going to live. It obviously changes their life because either they live there or they could live there. So before we dismiss the whole idea of having an international lunar city as total science fiction that could never happen, and so let's not waste our time on it, let's suspend disbelief and look at the concept a little bit. And first of all, what are we talking about? Talking about, in order to have a stable society, thousands of people living on the moon. The model for this, we ran a conference at Brown last year about this. We used McMurdo Sound and the McMurdo base in Antarctica as an example. McMurdo has 2,000, 2,500 people living there, which is enough to at least have a clinic and have a little radio station, have places to eat, have a life. It's not the life you would have in Manhattan or in Sofia, but it is small town life where previously there was just a military base and people did missions to Antarctica. Now we live on Antarctica. So a few things about the International Lunar City are kind of interesting. One is, why is it international? By definition, it has to be international. We have the International Space Station. Why is that international? Well, because we wanted to create a coalition of countries, and we also, it's just expensive. And you want to divide that cost among many players. So, there's people who provide transportation, there's people who provide modules, there's people who provide basic parts of it, and we all cooperate together to create an otherwise unaffordable object, in that case the International Space Station. But the International Lunar City is not just international because of that practicality of money. It's also international because the moon does not belong to a country, just as Antarctica does not belong to one country. And part of the reason to build McMurdo is to keep it that way. If you think of Antarctica and the moon as international parks of the Earth, that we don't want to have disturbed. The best way to make sure that they are not exploited by individuals for individual gain and possibly polluted, in some way, is to be there and to have a presence. And that was a big driver for the countries. I think 35 or 36 countries originally cooperated to build the city at McMurdo. And that's another reason we want an International Lunar City. The thing that's interesting about the International Lunar City in terms of as a project that's the opposite of a mission, obviously cities are more or less eternal. If the city can become self-sufficient, it will exist essentially forever. When you think about just the incredibleness of that, to have children born on the moon who are natives of the moon is something that is, we're talking about an entire mindset change in what is human civilization. It's the first time that we have actually lived in a permanent way away from Earth. In order to do that, you need everything on the moon. You need hospitals, you need entertainment, you need ways to get exercise, to recreate. Nobody wants to spend their life living in an office, right? You need places to go, swimming pools, mountain bike, whatever it is that you like to do, dance, art, it all has to be there. It can't just be this sterilized NASA laboratory. It is actually a city that has everything. And that means it needs to be governed. And that means you need politicians, you need political scientists, you need pharmacists, you need doctors. There's no form of profession on Earth that wouldn't be necessary on the plumbers, electricians, various kinds of technicians, people who repair things, people who maintain things, people who clean things. All those people will need to be resident on the moon to make it work. People who entertain other people, people who counsel other people, people who teach other people. So for the first time also, space does not become a sandbox for certain kinds of technical people who then make it their mission to interest me and you in astrophysics. Okay, and I'm pretty close to astrophysics. I build satellites as my profession, but I'm not interested, and I'm still not interested 40 years into this business. So the amount of interest that everyone in the public has in being an astrophysicist is limited. They're interested in being a pharmacist. They're interested in being a coach. They're interested in doing what they want to do. They're not interested in changing themselves to be what NASA wants them to be in order to be interested in the next mission. And that's what the Lunar City really offers. It offers a possibility for people who do whatever they do in their lives to do that in a new outpost in space that would be the International. It's a life-changing innovation. It's not a mission. It's a permanent change. And one interesting thing that is both positive and negative is that the head of ESA, Dr. Mueller, came out and said, he didn't promote it, he suggested it as a possible agenda in space, a village on the moon. And unfortunately, I saw this same thing happen in small satellites. You can kill an idea by half doing it, right? Lockheed came out and said, we're going to build small satellites. Of course, what Lockheed meant by a small satellite was 1,000 kilograms. That is not what we mean by a small satellite. To me, a small satellite is something that 8 people can build. Just because it's a little lighter, that's a lightweight, big satellite. So you kind of kill the innovation by, oh yeah, we're doing that. All right, so okay, ESA is going to have an International Lunar City, but it's going to be there to do what? To do science. So who's going to be there? A bunch of scientists. And what does that leave? First grade teachers, guidance counselors, orthopedists, not interested. It has nothing to do with them. If you do the idea halfway, it just becomes another mission, a very ambitious mission, but a mission. So we're talking about a city, a complete city with all the good and all the bad things that cities have. Hospitals, schools, homes, businesses, hotels, a place you can go on vacation, live performance, visual arts, and natives who are born there and maybe grow up there and maybe never go to Earth. If they go to Earth once because everybody's talking about it, I'd like to see it. A lot of people born in California don't leave California, or they do it just once in their life for a vacation. And oh, by the way, yeah, we'll have telescopes and science. It's an interesting place to be. Why wouldn't you have telescopes and scientists and probably other kinds of things going on the moon that interest narrow niches of humanity? But in general, it's a place to live. So how will the International Lunar City change space? It adds the other 99% of society to the mix. That's really all that matters. When computers stopped being for scientists and large businesses, that's when all the innovation happened. That's when the internet happened. That's when computer games happened. That's when smartphones happened. None of that was happening in the day of the IBM 360, IBM 370 with thousands of punch cards that you went to the computer center and loaded them in to do a highly complex calculation of how molecules collide with each other, or a financial projection, economic projection of what price levels were going to be in the United States over the next 20 years. No, you're now using the computer to do, just to talk to your friends, just to do what's up. And that's what we want to have happen in space. But there are other benefits. One that particularly appeals to me personally is that unlike the space station, you can't go there every week or every month, bring up fresh linens and bring all the dirty stuff back, bring up oxygen, bring the empty tanks back, bring up water, bring up food, bring up, pizza cooked for, whatever, to be habitable in the space, usable in the space environment. The moon has to run on its own. And therefore, because the moon natively has no oxygen and water is very hard to come by, though it is present, it has to become essentially a closed ecosystem where everything that's used is reused and virtually nothing is thrown away. It becomes the first truly reusable society. We talk about reusability on Earth, but we don't do it because we don't have to do it. On the moon, you have to do it. And in that sense, the moon becomes a model for how we should live on the Earth. Everything that we innovate to live on the moon is immediately usable for how we live on the Earth if we plan to remain on the Earth for the long term, right? And of course, the thing that I started off talking about, settlers versus explorers. Almost everyone is a settler. I mean, maybe we're an explorer within our career, usually not. But in the end, we live in a house, or we live in an apartment, we have neighbors, we use the infrastructure of stores, of schools, of airports, of libraries, of everything that's around us, of hospitals. We're all settlers. And yet space up till now has only been for explorers. So that makes all the difference because we change space from the purview of certain people to everybody. Okay, is this the only non-mission? If we're not willing to go to the moon, is that the only non-mission that we can do in space? And of course it's not. And one of the ones that's sitting right in front of our noses, but we really still haven't taken it seriously, is tourism in space. And the Virgin Galactic model of just taking people into space for a few minutes to see what things look like from 100 kilometers up. And before you do that, to spending a week at a place like Star City, learning all about what it's like to be an astronaut, about how you dress, about how it feels, about how it's navigated, about what you're going to see and what you're going to experience through every portion of the voyage, how to take pictures, how to move about the cabin, how to function, albeit for a brief period of time, in the space environment. Space tourism is not a mission that you do one time for the benefit of a few odd people in society who have a particular interest in a particular niche. It's something that anybody, okay, you have to have the means. You have to be able to afford it. And right now it will be fairly expensive to the level I couldn't afford it. Most of you probably couldn't afford it. But most technologies start off very expensive when they first come out. Digital cameras were very expensive. Color televisions. I remember when color televisions came out, we didn't have one because they were too expensive. Now every smartphone is a color television as a parenthesis. It's not really the hard thing that the smartphone does. Oh, by the way, it's a television. So things change with time, but you have to take the first step, and the first step usually fairly expensive. Okay, other things that we do for the moon become non-missions. For instance, agriculture in space is not a mission. It's another way of doing agriculture. Okay, granted, very expensive, but it might find a particular niche in growing certain types of materials. We might decide to build certain kinds of infrastructure to be able to get back and forth to the moon. One of those, just as long as we're talking about things that are completely impossible to conceive of, which I don't think are impossible, would be the space elevator or some other way using tethers to lower the cost of getting back and forth to the moon. So once you have that, of course, you can do a million other things in space that you couldn't do before. And of course, if you have an international city on the moon, nothing stops you from having an international city, 2 international cities on the moon. Maybe one on the far side and one on the side that faces Earth, or another international city on Mars. So, but would you build an international city on Mars before you build an international city on the moon? Probably not. So it's just the first of that type of city non-mission that you could conceive of. Of course, on Earth, we are surrounded by things that are not missions. And every time you talk about non-missions, people, what else is there? We're so brainwashed, to use a very strong word, to think of space in terms of missions that we don't realize that a highway is not a mission. A high school is not a mission. You don't build a high school because of a mission to prove, look, we built a high school. And in theory, thousands of students could show up there every morning at 8 o'clock, and hundreds of teachers, and education would go on. Okay, we did that. Now we'll do something else. No, you build a high school. You know, the high school that my father went to is the high school that I went to, and there's still kids going there now. It's a part of the infrastructure of the city that I grew up in. So those are all non-missions, and space is filled with missions, as if there were nothing else to do in space, and there is nothing else to do in space if you don't have the infrastructure. So the two go together. Missions are the opposite of infrastructure. And I want to just conclude this talk by talking about something that seems almost unrelated, because I used to speak very critically of sci-fi, of science fiction. And the reason I did is that science fiction writers quite often, and movie producers and so on, write about and depict things that are actually impossible. And as a kind of an engineer physicist type, that I objected to that. And I didn't like saying to them, oh, we could do this, we could travel faster than the speed of light, we can take off in a little sports car type thing and end up on Alpha Centauri, you know, for lunch and come back. I mean, those kinds of things are just, okay, maybe 1,000 years from now, someone may discover something that we don't know right now. But on the other hand, to me that was a negative. But on the other hand, science fiction does something that we space people have proven to be incapable of doing, and that is having a vision, getting people excited about possibilities. And my favorite example of sort of positive science fiction is Star Trek. Star Trek's pretty old, so I date myself talking about it. But Star Trek had the flip phone. Star Trek had the thing that you put in your ear that looked a lot like a Bluetooth earphone that also did simultaneous translation, which we now have. There's competition. Which service are you going to use for translation? That you can make a phone call now through Skype, and thanks to Microsoft, you can make a phone call from Italy, speak in Italian, and the person in America hears you speaking in English in near real time, not exactly real time, but we're nearly there. Star Trek had tablets, and everybody was writing on tablets. Nobody wrote on paper. So we need sci-fi because sci-fi points to going beyond what we're doing right now. We all say in space that we're all about that, and yet we keep doing the same thing. We keep working for 10 years in our dark little, caverns, and then doing the impossible on television for 10 minutes, and then saying, for the good of humanity, give us another $1 billion, we'll do it again. And that is what we can't keep doing. What we need to do next is really something different, really something that challenges us. And we actually could do the lunar city. We actually could do these other things of infrastructure, of non-missions, but we need the vision, the desire to do that and to go beyond what I call the mission mindset.